Hey guys, it's Drew here, quick video blog. I wanted to talk today about the Dave Chappelle special that I just saw. I think it's called 846, I believe. I don't know if I got that right, but I think that's the name of it. Anyway, I have been a fan of Dave Chappelle's for a while. I mean, a fan of his comedy. I don't, when it comes to these people and these personalities, I'm not one of those type of people that, like, if I saw him in public, I'd be like, oh my God, there's Dave Chappelle. I'm not one of those people. I like the man's work. And I think that he's a comedic genius. I think he's an absolute comedic genius. And I like his work in general. And I've watched all the specials on Netflix prior to this. I've watched a lot of his older work when he was much younger. I've seen him in movies and whatnot. And I always found him to be a very intelligent and, very gifted comedian, who kind of like George Carlin. You know what I mean? Like, he would basically talk about the realities of life, but he'd make you laugh at the same time. Now, in regards to this new special that he did, I have to honestly say, like, I just didn't feel the comedy side of it. It felt like a lecture. And he had another special on Netflix that was like a lecture, but it was kind of funny and it was very thought provoking. This lecture, in my opinion, was not very thought provoking because the reason why I'll say this because Dave Chappelle, I know for a fact that Dave Chappelle is very knowledgeable. You know how I know? I know because when Hollywood tried to get him to sell his soul for $50 million, and they wanted him to put on a dress and they wanted him to do all these things, he said no. And he went to Africa and people said he went crazy and all this stuff, but he basically was not willing to sell his soul. Okay. And I'm not saying that he did by doing by doing these specials that he's doing. But what I am saying is that I know that he's very knowledgeable. And because I know that he's knowledgeable, I just don't see how he could view these protests, not just the protests, but the riots and the looting and all the things that came out of that. I don't know how he sees that as the streets speaking for themselves. To be honest with you, if it was truly organic and if it was truly people speaking for themselves, I would have no problem with it. The issue is that it's not truly people speaking for themselves. It's not. If you trace the funding and you trace the organization, the money, the funding, the masterminding of this goes back to George. And I'm not talking about George Floyd. I'm talking about George Soros. Okay? That's the problem I have with this. The money, the funding, the planning, the organization, and the execution of this goes back to George Soros. That's the problem I have with it. And I know that Dave Chappelle is smart enough to know that. So, because his past comedy has come from the heart and his past comedy was direct and straightforward and kind of told you exactly what he was feeling, based on what he knew, this felt like it missed a little bit. And it's not because he's dissing Laura Ingraham or Candace Owens, and I happen to identify as a conservative. He dissed Trump supporters before, he dissed conservatives before, and I thought it was hilarious. I just didn't think, there's so much he could have said about Candace Owens that would have been funny. There's so much he could have said about her. There's so much he could have said about Laura Ingraham that would have been funny. There's so much that he could have said. He could have really, I just didn't think it was funny. I didn't find it offensive, but I didn't find it funny. And I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that I feel like this special that he did wasn't really a special. And I feel like it was one of his worst, actually. It just wasn't, it wasn't funny. I mean, if you listen to the actual thing, nobody was laughing. Nobody was laughing. You couldn't hear anybody laughing. It was basically a very somber lecture. And I have no problem with lectures. But when you're going to lecture, I hold you to a different standard than if you are just going to do comedy. If you're doing comedy, you're doing it to make us laugh. Anything goes. You know what I'm saying? It's just laughs. Laughter is the best medicine, right? So if you're doing comedy, it's just laughs, no big deal. But when you're lecturing, I feel that when you're lecturing somebody, or the people that you're lecturing have to be, to a degree, willing to listen to what you have to say, right? And people are willing to listen to Dave Chappelle because he's got a voice. The main reason why people listen to Dave Chappelle is because he's funny. So now, when we're listening to Dave Chappelle lecture us, it's still valuable because he's a very intelligent dude. He's gifted. But it's held to a different standard. When somebody's lecturing me, I want to know if they know what they're talking about. Because lecturing is time consuming. If I'm supposed to sit there and listen to you lecture me, that means that what you're saying has to have some value. What you're saying has to have some importance because my time is valuable. My time is important. If I decide that I'm going to listen to you because I'm going to get a laugh, but instead I get a lecture, I'm going to evaluate that performance based on the criteria of a lecture. There were some things that were funny, like when he said the thing about LeBron James going back. The things he said about LeBron James is true. LeBron James is a very upstanding citizen. He's a phenomenal basketball player. He's a great husband and he's responsible. He's the best at what he does, right? I don't disagree with that. I think LeBron James is a phenomenal athlete. You know, I just think that when it comes to political matters, I don't think he should just shut up and dribble, but I do think that his political matters are kind of dictated by the establishment. Because if you notice, when China says shut up and dribble, it's no problem. But when Laura Ingraham says it, there's a problem. You know what I mean? And to be honest with you, I don't agree with either. I don't think China should say it. I don't think that Laura Ingraham should say it. But I do think that these athletes and these artists and these comedians, they can poke fun at the establishment a little bit, but they can't poke that much fun. And if you notice, like, I don't know, but I got the sense that Dave Chappelle was a little agitated because he knew he was holding back. He couldn't go back. He couldn't really go on stage and say what he really wanted to say. He said some of the things he really wanted to say, but he couldn't say all of it. He couldn't say all of it. Let's not forget, again, I bring you back to my first point. This is a man who refused to sell his soul, rejected $50 million because he didn't want to put on a dress, because the conspiracy of having black men in dresses in order to get promoted in Hollywood is a very real thing. It's an emasculating practice. It's a way for the people who are directors and producers and the higher ups to let these people know that you are still, in a way, my slave. No matter how much money you make, I made you wear a dress to get that money. That's what that is. Dave Chappelle told these people to go fuck themselves. He's not wearing a dress. But that doesn't mean that he didn't compromise. And I think that he did compromise because he's leaving certain subjects untouched that I know that man is knowledgeable about. He has to be knowledgeable about it. If you're talking about these protests and you have not mentioned the name George Soros once, you're just not going to hit. If you're going to lecture me about these protests and you're not going to mention George Soros and his funding of Black Lives Matter, you're missing. You're missing. It means either one of two things. It means you're either fast asleep still and you don't know what's going on, or you do know what's going on and you're not allowed to talk about it. And in Dave Chappelle's case, I think he's too gifted to be fast asleep. He's too gifted to be up in that world and see what's going on and not know. He knows. He just wasn't allowed to talk about it. And so he compromised. That's what made it hard to watch. That's what made it difficult to watch. You know, I'm not a critic. But I'm just saying from my point of view, it was interesting because it's always interesting to hear Dave Chappelle speak on something because he's the way that his mind thinks and the way that he delivers stuff is not only funny and entertaining, but it provokes thought. You know, it's thought provoking. So it was interesting. So I sat through the whole thing, but I feel like he missed. And it's weird to me because he never misses. But he explained before that he wanted to do comedy and he wanted to do the things he could do so he could speak without a filter. And I just believe that based on what I watched, he was speaking without a filter, but he was speaking without a filter on the people he's allowed to speak without a filter on. You're allowed to bash Candace Owens. You're allowed to bash Laura Ingraham. That's easy. That's easy. The establishment does not like Candace Owens. The establishment does not agree with her because she's a black woman who doesn't agree or is not cohesive with the general idea of what black women, quote unquote, are supposed to think like. You know, she's not worried, I mean, for lack of a better phrase, she's not worried about her edges and she's not worried about her lashes and she's not worried about, and she's not towing the normal lines. Now, don't get me wrong. I disagree with some of Candace Owens' practices. Like, I disagree with, I understand that George Floyd was a criminal, right? I understand that he wasn't a perfect human being. I get it. I understand he was a very flawed human being, matter of fact. He has a long rap sheet where most of us don't, right? He's a very flawed human being. But all I'm saying is that if you're going to talk about George Floyd, right, and you're going to talk about the bad things about him, why not mention the cop and the things that the cop did in the same light? That's all. You know that you're communicating with the black community, right? So if you're communicating with the black community and you know that the black community is very sensitive to race, I learned this a while ago. You have to engage them on their emotions or else you're going to be seen as tone deaf. I personally don't like when people engage me on my emotions because I'm logical. I think that when people are trying to engage me on my emotions, they're trying to be manipulative. They're trying to get me out of my logical space and have me think emotionally. But people who naturally think emotionally, they don't think that way. They want their emotions to be acknowledged. And Candace Owens, although what she says is thought-provoking and she's brilliant, she's articulate, in a way, she's emotionally tone deaf. And that's what happens when you're kind of like a factual person. Like Candace Owens is a very logical person, but her message comes across as cold. And that's why it's not received well by an emotional black community who reason and think with their emotions. You see what I'm saying? It's such an interesting thing. I'm not saying one way is better than the other. I'm just trying to explain the differences between them. And I like it or not, I don't agree with everything Candace Owens says, but I think her voice is important. I agree with I agree with like 90% of what she says. The other 10% I don't agree with. Like I don't agree with every single time a black person is a victim of something, we have to bring up a whole rap sheet. Whether they have a rap sheet or not, some things are just not acceptable. You don't always have to bring up a rap sheet. But to her credit, it is important for the black community to stop downplaying real role models like Ben Carson, like Candace Owens, like Alan West. Stop downplaying, like Thomas Sowell. Stop downplaying these real role models and glorifying people who commit crimes and people who sell drugs and whatnot. If you are, as a human being, God knew that we have a tendency to worship, but that worship is supposed to be reserved for him. As a human being, you are limited by that by which you worship. You reap as you sow. You are limited by that with which you worship, that with which your headspace is at most of the time. So if you worship, if you glorify, if you aspire to, all these people, Al Sharpton, all these people, these rappers and these celebrities that are the louder voices in the black community. If you aspire to all this stuff and you pay attention to all this stuff and you watch all this stuff for the most part, that is what you're going to exude eventually. That is what's going to come out of your heart. It's going to come out of your actions. And the Bible says from the heart arises all the issues of life. Who can trust the heart? The heart is deceitful. So it's something to think about. It's something to think about. When you're watching Chappelle, when you're watching all these people, take everything with a grain of salt because it's like nobody always gets it right. Nobody. And that's all I got to say. Peace.